stood about 30 feet from what people refer to as a wendigo, though I thought I was gonna die. I can post a story if interested, but I've tried before and thread was washed out by RPing losers. Calling BS, that thing would have ripped you apart if you were feet from it. Maybe, maybe not. All depends on whether or not Anon is a Templar of K. Not a Templar of K, but I'm almost certain I came across it after it killed 2 German shepherds, which might have been what saved me when I first saw it. I thought it was a big white dog. It was crawling on all fours. It never stood up, never vocalized, just watched me. It only moved when I moved, but it was more of a maneuver, like it was trying to get a good look. It was incredibly fast though. Yeah, I can do that. I don't think I'm going to green text though, so sorry if it's a little long. From about the age of 16 to the age of 21, 24 now, I used to go on walks late at night. My sleep schedule was fucked after school ended, so I spent most of my time awake during the late night, early morning hours. But living in a more suburban area, it was never really an issue. That isn't to say I live in a nice area, just that it's not really as crime-ridden as it could be. But I digress. I'd worked out a pretty solid schedule for these walks, leaving anywhere between 10 to 12 at night and coming back either when I had enough serenity for the night or my legs began to ache. Generally though, each walk would last 3 to 5 hours, during which I would travel out of my neighborhood into the neighboring areas. Another thing to note is that my neighborhood, for whatever reason, only has a handful of streetlights, usually at the small stop sign intersections. Because of this, I became very comfortable with being in the dark and developed a love for the moon. I always made it a point to leave a little earlier during full moons to enjoy the peace, silence, and that glow of the pure moonlight cast over everything. So anyway, on this particular night, it was fall. I remember because the air just began to carry a chill and a really specific sort of smell that seems to come with the changing of the seasons. I left a little later than normal that night, having been distracted by gaming. I do distinctly recall staring up at the moon and being overcome by a strange feeling. I don't really know how to describe it, only that it felt different. Even now though, I think it was the schedule being off kilter that particular night that caused that feeling, because that's just what makes the most sense. Anyway, I took my normal path, heading down a few streets of little note and making my way toward a favorite stretch of road. It's one of those that have no streetlights to speak of, and the houses along the sides are bigger. The type with the big yards pushing the buildings 100 or so feet from the roadside. I remember seeing the road and staring into the darkness, accustomed to the sight even with the moon as bright as it was. It always gets brighter inside. It's just a trick of the shadows, since there are some spots on the road that are covered pretty heavily with trees, and I was almost overcome with a very specific feeling, one that I hadn't felt in several years of taking these walks. Dread. To be completely honest, I was surprised at myself and irritated, and it was that irritation that made me continue walking. I ended up quietly humming to myself as I entered the darkness, Lila by Derek and the Dominoes if you're curious, and had made it about 100 yards down the road when I heard a loud scuffling down the driveway to my left. About 10 yards away from me, I moved into a heavily shaded area and watched, noting that whatever was moving down the graveled driveway was big and sounded like a dog. Much to my surprise, it seemed to be a huge white dog, at least until my eyes focused on it. In the moonlight, sometimes things take on an eerie glow and shapes can be misconstrued, so I was only watching it with curiosity until it got a little closer, and I realized that it wasn't white fur shining in the moonlight, but skin. Bare, pale skin. This caused a shift in my perspective, and I began inspecting the rest of the new sight, only to realize it wasn't a dog at all, but a man. A very tall, incredibly emaciated man. His skin was pulled tight over his skeleton and he trotted along on all fours as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At this point, I was a definite combination of freaked out and interested. So I took a single step closer, as quietly as I could, and squinted my eyes to get more specific details. Its legs seemed to be normally shaped as far as a human's go, but the forearms were elongated, giving it a very surreal hunch that was obviously not human. Oh, another thing to note is that the head was completely bald, and the moonlight hit it and made it glow, which is sort of funny. And then I noticed it was looking at me. The light reflected off its eyes with a dim yellow shine, which is what drew me into getting a good look at its face. It was featureless, not blank, but there was nothing notable about it. It had no ears that I could see. Its nose, if it wasn't a trick of the light, was very small. No lips to speak of, and it just stared. We stared at each other for several long seconds, my mind reeling as I struggled to come to some sort of solution of how I would get out of this situation. But none came. That is, until the car's headlights flashed down the road. In my idiotic half panic, I turned my head to see if the car was coming down the road I was on, and as soon as I did, I heard a rapid, heavy shuffling. I jerked my head back and the thing was gone. I struggled with keeping my fear in check and made a cursory scan of the area around me, and I found it, sitting in the yard to my left. It was about 20 feet away this time, sitting in this big yard just outside of the light being given off by the home's porch light. It was one of those huge yards I mentioned earlier, so there was some space between it and the house too. The only reason I noticed it at all was because I had caught the very end of its movements. Otherwise, the yard was heavily shaded by a bunch of trees. So I stared, and it stared. We watched each other, me standing on the side of the road in the dark, and it hunched down in this yard, motionless as far as I can see. Finally, my mind settled into a solution I could actually make work. I have phone shortcuts, and I know my best friend is awake, as I'd been talking to him before I left. So I called him, never taking the phone from my pocket until I heard the muffled, "What's up?" of my friend answering. I placed my hand over the light sensor in the screen to make sure it was dark when I pulled it from my pocket, placed the phone to my head and said, "I'm on, street name. Get here as soon as you can." Luckily, he was able to understand how serious I was being and hung up immediately. Thus began the longest 5 minutes of my life. I closed my phone and slid it back into my pocket, never taking my eyes off the thing. Fortunately for me, it seemed keen on simply staring in turn. I don't remember my thought process in detail, only that one thought of, "I can't believe this is happening," repeating over and over every few seconds. Then, mercifully, headlights. Knowing that it was my friend, I began slowly backing away from the oncoming car. The creature, apparently realizing that the vehicle was heading in our direction, turned and bolted away, slamming into the fence between the yard it was in and the driveway I had come from, scaling the fence and disappearing. Feeling safe enough to turn, I was getting ready to run to my friend's car. I slowly rotate towards the headlights to see not my friend's car, but a police patrol car. I froze in place as the headlights watched over me and the car just cruised on by. My friend's vehicle right behind it. He pulled over and I was in the car before he even put it in park. Not that it mattered much, because I had told him to get the fuck out of there immediately. He kept asking questions, but it was around the time that the full weight of the experience hit me, and I just sort of sat there in silence, trying to process what I had seen. He drove off and I noticed that the police car had stopped in the driveway that the thing had come from, with 2 officers getting out and making their way toward the home. It occurred to me then that if they had been called by the owner of the house, a woman with 2 big German shepherds, that if she had reported a disturbance, the cops would most likely have stopped and questioned me, unless they were given a more specific description. And like I said, I haven't seen those dogs since. Geez, as someone who used to take a lot of walks at night, before I got chased out of the local park, and all the way to Fallback Point by someone making elk calls, you acted a shitload smarter than I ever would have in the situation. Also, even worshipping at the altar of K would likely not have saved you in that situation. It could move that bloody fast. This happened in freaking suburbia? Did the neighborhood border a large forest, perhaps? The alternative is not something I want to ponder at the moment. Yeah, it was fast. For a little more accurate perspective, the space it cleared and the time it took me to look behind myself then back was about 40 feet, diagonally from where our position was before. But no forest. That specifically is something I've thought about in the last few years. I don't know why it was here of all places. I'm not even sure where it could have come from or gone. I have theories. I partially do not want to share them, for fear in doing so might make them legitimate. Something that moves that bloody fast invalidates way too many forms of infantry portable weaponry. That's relatively easy to pin down. Theories. Not many of them good. Sewers. I don't know why I didn't consider the sewers before. That's a bit troubling. But if you got ideas, please tell me. I don't really leave the house at night anymore, and the more I can settle this, the better. I really feel like I lucked out, and I miss going out on walks at night, but I'm not feeling like running into it again. From what he was hinting at with the infantry portable weapon bits, the theory would probably involve some secret government super soldier experiment, but maybe I'm way off. Maybe, I don't know. There's no answer that I feel would be good enough, in a weird sort of way, like no explanation is adequate for what happened. I told other, older relatives about it, and the general consensus from them is always something akin to, "There are old things out there, Anon." And that's sort of it, like, what the fuck? That's easy for you to say, old bastard, but if you've got ideas, please tell me. Okay, so the nearest medium-large forest doesn't see much human traffic anymore, at least not hypothetically. That of the overgunned nature and in mass numbers, so it leaves the forest, migration, and seeks out easier prey since it got used to the taste of man-flesh and would rather not have to deal with fucking aim-dodging hunting parties in order to stake its hunger. Or maybe it had been forced to flee from its former hunting grounds because of some overgunned hunting groups, S&D squads. In any case, it moves to the local town outskirts of a minor city and begins stalking the streets. Check the missing persons reports in your area. See if there's an uptick in missing vagrants or a downtick in local homeless population. I feel like a fucking sociopath for even considering that idea. I mean, thinking of the entire demographic as beast kibble? For fuck's sake. Pro tip, don't. Do not walk outside at night, no matter what. This is something else. Something that predates modern governments. This is something that those that lived here before, those of the First Nations, knew somewhat well. Maybe a hybrid of some of those creatures. Somewhat like a koi wolf, the infantry portable weapon bit. Just thinking of some kind of weapons one would take out while a hunting expedition to gank one of these things. The main problem is the fucking aim dodging. The thing about beastos, they don't know how your guns work and thus can't dodge your shots. Unless it's supposed to be really smart or something? I don't know. But then you think it wouldn't go out and fuck around with people and dogs and shit in a populated area. It's funny you say that about the homeless population. It was an observation I made a long time ago, when I was still regularly walking. Remember, I've been wandering the city for years by the point of this story. We don't have a homeless population. I've never seen a homeless person in this city, just outside of it. Sure, there are camps, but here? Nope. I've only ever come across trash and stuff, what I assume to be the remains of a camp. Well, whatever it is, the police obviously didn't run across it, but apparently they did know that they should be looking for something. The question is, what were they told? It might have survived long enough, and or witnessed other creatures, other of its kind, or separate subspecies that don't share the same holy fucking cheat speed, get killed by the previously easy prey that are now armed with bang sticks. But then again, there are incidents of bears and shit wandering into downtown areas, albeit not hunting for man-flesh. Might be an aberrant specimen? Probably were informed of something in the resident's yard by the same individual. Shite. Can you just imagine watching something outside tear apart your pets? They probably would have had guns drawn for that. Even if they did just think it was a coyote or a wolf or a bear or mountain lion or whatever lives in that area. I have no idea. Honestly, I always put off approaching the woman simply because I was afraid. I didn't want to upset her, and it just sort of fell away from my priorities. Taking the name so it's easier to differentiate. This isn't really an area where guns are a common thing. Lots of middle-aged, middle-class white people living near a city, if that helps. Still, if they got a report something was attacking animals, the first thing they'd probably still think is wild, potentially dangerous animal. Partially advised to reaching out to her, or to members of her family that might live in the same house. As if it wasn't bad enough, that thing can fucking aim dodge. It's hunting in no guns, less guns states too. Okay, revising earlier comment. It's moved out of the woods to find better hunting grounds because nobody really fucking goes there anymore. Though cops at least still would be armed. Checking the account. Winnebago OP does not mention whether or not the officers drew their service pistols on approach, only they moved towards the property in question. I'm trying to recall if I saw them leave with weapons drawn, but all I remember is seeing both front doors open on the patrol car and the silhouettes of officers moving up the driveway. The headlights were throwing shadows, so I can't say for sure either way. Only that there were two of them. The city is Orangevale, California. It's not very noteworthy really, out of the way, but still pretty close to actually nice areas for most people, I suppose.